Hi, salesman. This is Jack Lacey. I am very proud and happy to bring you this record by my good friend Red Motley. I am sure it will stimulate and enthuse you, add to your selling power, and help you increase your income. This speech, "Nothing Happens Until Somebody Sells Something," was made by Red in Richmond, Virginia, to an audience of 2,000 salesmen while we were on a barnstorming trip together through the South. Red is one of the greatest salesmen I have ever known. He is also one of the most dedicated men in his devotion and efforts to make the world a better place for us salesmen to live in. I have watched and studied Red for more than 30 years. I have had the opportunity to work with him on scores of programs. Among others, we put on the first of the big sales rallies before one of the largest groups of salesmen ever assembled. There were more than 8,000 salesmen in the audience. We also conducted a rally together in Carnegie Hall. I think this is the first and the only time that salesmen ever spoke on the platform of that great institution. Red always fills us salesmen with enthusiasm and makes us tremendously proud of the fact that we are salesmen. I am sure that this record will do the same for you. Red was the first man ever to receive the Oscar from the National Sales Executives as America's Outstanding Salesman. When Red talks to you about selling, he is not reporting something that he has seen somebody do. He is telling you things that he has actually done himself. He is a very great salesman with the unusual ability of being able to pass his ideas and enthusiasm on to you and others. When I first met Red, he was a young advertising salesman in the Middle West. This was about 1930. Over the years, I have watched his tremendous progress. I saw Red take over Parade magazine when it was a small, struggling paper in the advertising field with a circulation of 1,800,000 and advertising sales of $2 million a year. Red made it great. Today, Parade has a circulation of more than 10 million and sales of over $25 million a year. He made it a leader among all the publications in the advertising field. You will be informed, inspired, and enthused by this great talk by this great salesman. I am very proud that I can bring to you this record by this great crusader for the betterment of salesmen everywhere. Here he is, our very good friend, Red Motley.
I was delighted to come down here tonight with Jack Lacey. Last night we were in Norfolk. Tomorrow night we're going to be in Greensboro, and Thursday night we're going to be in Winston-Salem. Jack and I are here because we believe that what you and we do for a living is important. And I'm delighted to come down here with Jack and talk to you men and women. I'm delighted because I believe that anybody in selling or distribution ought to be willing to plow back a little of his own time and his own money into the activities of our profession, the profession of selling. I didn't come down here to make a speech tonight. I came down here to sell an idea. Like Lacey, I have been selling for 30 years. And like Jack, I like what I've been doing. And because I like what I've been doing, it appears to have liked me. It's an idea that I've been talking about for 20 years. And God willing, I'll talk about it for 20 more. I accept the fact that we're all human. And in spite of the fact that we are told something, we don't always remember it. And it's well to be reminded of it. And so I'm going to try and sell you an idea, give you a little advice which I hope will improve your operation and improve the money in the commission check or the paycheck at the end of the week. The title of my talk tonight is Nothing Happens Until Somebody Sells Something. Nothing happens until somebody sells something. The first thing I want to sell you men and women tonight is basic and fundamental. Unless you and I, those of us engaged in selling, retail and wholesale, printed and personal, understand what we do and understand it in terms of benefit to others than ourselves, we will never do it well. We will always be vulnerable. The first thing any man who is going to realize on the great potential or capabilities he has in selling, the first thing he's got to do is to understand what he's doing. Why selling? Let me see if I can make that crystal clear and give you a better understanding of what you do. A lot of people talk about filling needs. A lot of people think of ourselves in terms of filling needs. Skip it. Not so. We haven't been a needy people for 50 years in this country. We're a prosperous people. We're not a needy people. We're not engaged in filling needs. We're engaged in something far more important than that. We're engaged in making people want things. We're want creators, not need fillers. Think of yourselves in terms of the most important people in America. Because this want-creating process, which we as salespeople understand, is the fundamental motivating power behind all progress in all fields. My grandmother died at age 85 in the city of Minneapolis. She never owned a vacuum cleaner in her life, but her floor was so clean you could eat off it. My mother owned a vacuum cleaner. Not because she was smarter than her mother or because the Motleys had any money, because we didn't. She owned that vacuum cleaner because a lot of salespeople rang that doorbell out on Pleasant Avenue so many times, pushed their way through that screen door so often, demonstrated that rig so effectively that Mama got to wanting that thing so badly that she put the arm on the old man to get the down payment up, and she kept it there till he made every payment so they didn't take that rig away from her. That's how we've got more vacuum cleaners than all the rest of the world combined. Not because a man in Ohio invented the vacuum cleaner. He did. Funny thing, though, he went broke. Flat broke. Here was a better way for keeping floors clean. Lord knows the housewives of America needed it. But they didn't want it. And he went broke. And he took his invention to a fellow by the name of Hoover. And Hoover, doggone nearly went broke. Why? Because he couldn't get any department stores or retail stores to handle it. Because they said quite properly, nobody wants it. There's no demand for it. Why should we give it any floor space? And so he had to go out and devise his own method of distribution. And he developed a door-to-door selling technique. Today, every department store, specialty shop handles vacuum cleaners. And why? Why? Because a lot of people want them. That's why. We've got more automobiles than all the rest of the world combined. Not because we need them, but because a great automobile industry made our people want to go someplace sitting down. That's right. And they made them want it so badly that even during the last Great Depression, they would face almost eviction from their homes rather than miss a payment on the old jalopy and run the risk of repossession. And what happened? Hundreds of thousands of good jobs in Detroit and other cities manufacturing automobiles and parts, and in the oil business, and in the gasoline business, and in the garage business, and in the service business. That's the reason why we've got more good jobs than all the rest of the world combined. Let's understand that. Let's have done with all this nonsense about America having some particular patent on inventive genius or some particular excess of natural resources. The only thing in the world we've got is the greatest thing in the world. We've developed the power to make people want things they don't need. I've been married to the first and only Mrs. Motley for 22 years. And up to 2 years ago, I thought those first 20 years had been wonderful, every one of them. But 2 years ago, I began to wonder how we ever got through those first 20 years because we didn't have a mink coat. I really began to worry about that. I really did. Little dearie got to wanting a mink coat 2 years ago so badly that it was no longer a luxury, it was an absolute necessity. And I was lucky to get off buying her just the top half a jacket. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with that? What's wrong with Harper's and Vogue, those beautiful style magazines that dress up those gals in those beautiful furs so that they look at them and drool and they want them? What's wrong with a great department store like Miller & Rose right here in Richmond, putting those mannequins in the window dressed in furs and then running ads in the Richmond paper saying, come on, girls, make the down payment in August, and by January you'll have enough down on it, you can take it out and wear it while you pay for it the next 10 years. What's wrong with that? How else did we build 60 million good jobs? Some of them in trapping and processing and lining manufacturers and sewing and distribution and servicing and storage. How else? You're engaged in the most fundamental process in the world. Let's understand that process. It operates not alone in creature comforts. In the field of commerce, it operates in every field. You and I know that kids need an education. And what have we done? Why, we've built great educational factories like this one we're in here tonight, all over the land, even out in the rural areas, the great consolidated schools. We run buses into the far remote rural areas to bring the kids into the consolidated schools because we know the kid needs an education. But we're also smart enough to know that no kid ever got an education unless he wanted it, unless some enlightened parent or teacher sold him the idea of getting in and digging for an education. There isn't a man or woman in this room tonight but what would agree with me that the principles of Jesus Christ are needed in the world as never before in the whole Christian era. And because we know they're needed, we've built great educational factories in every town and hamlet in America, cathedrals, synagogues, and churches. And we've staffed them with fine production people, ministers, rabbis, and priests. And we've given them the greatest products in history. 3 great creeds, Catholic, Protestant, and Jew, refined over the centuries. And what are we worrying about? Why, we're worrying because the pews are half empty on Sunday. And there's juvenile delinquency in some of the parishes. The need is there. What's wrong? Why, the church is forgotten in too many instances. That a sanctimonious demeanor, a deep bass voice, or a turned-around collar is not enough. In the days when the church was vigorous and growing and militant, the great preachers were great salesmen. They didn't sit on their fanny in the store or the factory waiting for the customer to come in and take it off them. They went on foot and horseback, even back to Galilee, and sold and made converts, because needs were never enough. Wants are the only things that matter. And what's the difference between making a woman want a better way of keeping house, or making a child want a better education, or making a citizen want a better moral character? What's the difference? You're engaged in a great work. Lift your sights. Understand what you're doing. Let me close that point by telling a story about my experience. I went to work for a publishing company selling space, Collier's Weekly. They taught me how to sell space. They taught me very well. I got a raise. I got promoted. I got transferred to the Detroit office. And then one day, because Detroit is a Middle Western and a friendly town, one evening the neighbors next door came to call. And I heard Mrs. Motley describe to them how I made the Motley living. Oh, boy. She made the James boys sound like a couple of pikers. She took out a magazine, turned to a 4-color refrigerator ad and said, my husband sells those. The woman said, that's very interesting. My wife said, do you know what they get for them? The woman said, no, I haven't any idea. My wife said, $10,000. The woman said, for how many? My wife said, just one. And the woman fainted. I looked at the thing myself and for the first time realized that I didn't know what I was doing. I know how to do it. Oh, yes, I did. But I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know why that was important to anybody except the Motleys. I'd heard all this criticism of advertising, consumers research, and all that stuff, and I'd turn up my coat collar like this, hoping nobody would notice me because I had a nice job. It paid very well, thank you, and I didn't want there to be any change. I don't turn up my collar and sneak down the back alleys anymore, and in the 3 years following the discovery I made in 1931, I tripled my income as a salesman because for the first time I understood. I went back and discovered that a man by the name of Kelvin in 1900, the turn of the century, discovered the principle behind mechanical refrigeration. And 25 years later, in 1925, in this greatest of all markets, the United States of America, there were 3 or 4 little manufacturers, Copeland and Kelvinator, etc., making 75,000 of those mechanical ice boxes, selling them for $500 a piece, and none of them making any money. Then something happened. A couple of big guys, General Electric and General Motors with Frigidaire, got in the business. They did not build a better box, but they did something far more important. They came into Richmond and every other community in America, and they got a distributor, and he set up retailers, and they hired retail salesmen, and they hired showrooms, and they had them put a neon sign outside that said refrigeration, and they used billboards around the town, and they bought space in the local papers to tell the American housewife about this new and better method of preserving food, the protection, the waste, the elimination of spoilage. And in 1931, when this incident took place in Detroit, they're selling 2 million of those boxes. They're now $175, and even the Motleys have been able to afford one. For the first time, I knew that even Motley, this little pimple on the advertising sales fraternity in Detroit, was important. I was a part of something that was big, that was fundamental, that was making jobs and a better way of living for a lot of people. I was doing something that I didn't have to apologize for. And I didn't want my family or kids to apologize either. And so I sat the little woman down, and I told her that story. When I got all through, she looked me square in the eye and said, "Yep. But what happened to the Iceman?" I didn't know the whole story. What did happen to the Iceman? I don't think there's hardly a man or a woman in this room that knows. And you should, because it's a great American story. They didn't go down to Washington and get somebody to pass a law to keep them in business. They didn't get down and scream and yell to their senator, their congressman, or the president about the fact there was going to be some unemployment in the ice business if they let these electrical boys take the kitchen market away from them. They did not. They did a typically American thing. They taxed themselves, and none of them were big guys because they were all local operators, for money. And they put a kitty together, and they gave it to the Battelle Institute at Ohio State for research to find out new uses for Iceman's ice. And today, their volume is twice as big as it was when the electrical boys threw them out of the kitchens of America. They created a new want. And in the creation of the new want, they doubled their business and maintained employment and protected the investment that meant a good living for a lot of icemen and their families. That's what I'm talking about, and that's what you're doing. I ask you to understand it. The second thing you've got to do is to believe in what you're doing. Believe. I'll treat this very briefly by telling you my own story. I kept the world safe for democracy in World War I. In St. Paul. A very nice place in which to fight a war. We had no trouble up there, and when I got out of the Boy Scouts in December 1918, the only job I could get was in the iron mines of northern Michigan. I found myself working for the Townsite mine at Ironwood. The mines up there are closed shaft mines. It was dirty, back-baking, pick and shovel work, and besides that, I was scared to death every time that bucket went down underground. At the end of about 3 months, one night in the boarding house where I stayed, I met a fat, pink-cheeked, sassy-looking guy with a white shirt on and none of that red stuff under his nails, so I knew he was no miner, and I sat down next to him to see what made him tick. And I found out that he was a zither salesman. The old chick sales lap harp. He bought them for $5 from a wholesale house in Chicago. He never got less than $10 down, so he couldn't lose if he never collected another dime. It seemed like a wonderful idea to me. I threw away the pick and shovel and became a zither salesman forthwith. This was a wonderful machine. You didn't play it with a pick. It had a couple of octaves of keys. You played it like you play a piano one-handed. The keys tripped the hammers were down, hit the wires, made beautiful music. The mines are going full blast in the spring and summer of 1919. And there's nothing musical up there for those hunkies and their kids except this guy and his zithers. I went like a house on fire for 30 days. We gave away 30 sheets of music with every zither. And at the end of 30 days, my first customers came back and wanted more sheet music, and then the cat was out of the bag. The thing only played in the key of C. Right? When you got all through with Smiles and God Save the King, you couldn't do a thing with Dardanelle or Hindustan or any of the hot tunes of the day. Couldn't do a thing with them. No sharps, no flats, just the key of C. I was working to get a stake to go back to the University of Minnesota, and I sold those things right up to September 15th, 1919. Funny thing, though, I never sold as many of them per day or week after I found out it only played in the key of C. If you think you're selling a service or a product that only plays in the key of C, unless you believe implicitly in that product and the promises of the company behind the product, get another job, because you'll never go to town without belief in what you're doing. Spend a little time on it. Make sure, because in the process of making sure, you'll resell yourself, rededicate yourself, and if your experience is parallel to mine and any other top salesman I know of, you will begin to double your income. And the third thing a good professional salesman has got to think of and remember at all times is the fact that because this is a profession, you're never through. You must have training, but that's not enough. You must have more training. Professional. You heard me use that word. 3 things if you're going to be a pro. Understand what you're doing in terms of benefits for others and yourself and your immediate superior. Belief in the product and the company that you represent, and that takes some thought and some figuring. And the acceptance of the fact, like any good professional man accepts the fact that he's never through. That's what I mean by being a professional. And how do you find out whether you're a professional? I'll give you a simple test. How do you act when you're not selling? Let me illustrate what I mean, and watch for this. If you're a professional salesman, you're a salesman 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You don't just put it on when you get the body in front of the prospect and take it off when you leave his office. You don't put it on at 9 and take it off at 5. You're a salesman all the time. You eat, live, drink, sleep, and thrill to the prospect of being a want creator, which is the fundamental motivating force behind all human progress. But how do you know you're a pro? What do you do when you aren't actually selling? Let me tell you my story. This is how I discovered I was a pro. In 1944, I was traveling around the United States of America for the Committee for Economic Development. They were a local business committee. They had one of them here in Richmond. We had them all over the country, 2,300 committees. We got businessmen to get together to organize to find out where they were before the war, where they were during the war, where they'd be employment-wise after the war. And I'd been up in Rome, New York, organizing the town. They drove me at midnight down to Utica, where I was to catch a train for Boston. I had a meeting there the next morning. I'm tired. And in my hot little hand, I've got the most wonderful thing in the world in those days, because people were sitting on suitcases in the aisles and trains. I had a Pullman stub that entitled me to a single bedroom. The train's an hour and a half late. And when I get on, I dig up the little Pullman conductor. Must have been 85 years old. They probably brought him out of retirement. He didn't go 5 feet with his Adlers on. And I gave him the thing, and he looked at it and busted out laughing. I'd looked at that thing 8 or 10 times while I was walking around the station in Utica. I didn't see any jokes printed on it. I'm tired. What I have time for levity. But I'm a want creator. I'm a pro. And I didn't get indignant. I didn't throw my weight around. I did what any good want creator would normally, naturally, instinctively do. I said to him, I haven't had a good laugh all day. Tell me, what's so funny? Well, he said, there's a guy got on in Buffalo that thought he had that bedroom, too. And he said, oddly enough, he said, there's been a guy sound asleep in there since Toronto, where the car started. Very funny, very funny. Then I really knew I was a pro as I look back on it now, because instead of blowing my stack, I bought it. The government priority that got it for me and said I was entitled to it. I didn't start to throw my weight around. I knew that little guy was the only guy in the world that could get me horizontal between Utica and Boston, and I had to sell him. And so I found myself instinctively using the oldest, original, fundamental, simplest sales approach. We all know it. I said, tell me, I don't know much about railroading. You've obviously been in it a long time. You're an expert. How could a thing like that happen? Remember how you get them talking. You know that one? Simple, isn't it? Brother, that's all that little man needed. He took a deep breath. He threw back his head and he took off jet-propelled into space. And for 5 minutes, he explained to me what was wrong. And what do you think it was? Women. Women in railroading had no place in it. And he went on. He finally runs out of breath. Now, I don't agree with a thing the guy said, but I'm a pro. I'm a want creator. I don't believe a thing he said. Well, I've never had any trouble with women. But I'm no boob. I'm a want creator. So I said, well, sounds very logical, very plausible. Could be. I mean, you know more about that than I do, but tell me now, I'm tired. Could you do something about getting me someplace to sleep? So he shuffles those cards. You know how they do it? He said, how'd you like a drawing room? I said, drawing room? Gee, fine. How much extra? He said, extra? Why should you pay anything extra? I said, you bought a single bedroom, didn't you? You're entitled to it, aren't you? You didn't get it, did you? He said, boy, bring that band's bags. Come on through here. We'll go through down the stairs, see? Jesus. And there's a beautiful drawing room all waiting for me at no extra charge. I thanked him. And then, because I was curious, I said, how does it happen that with travel conditions the way they are, I'm this lucky? What'd you do for the guy that got on in Buffalo that was out of luck, too? He said, I gave him an upper. I said, he got on in Buffalo and got an upper? I get on in Utica and get a drawing room? He said, yeah, he got mad. He was no want creator. He was not a pro. How do you behave when you're not selling? That's the test of being a pro. The professional want creator uses common sense. Now that sounds very simple, doesn't it? But I'm going to talk to you now for about 5 minutes because I hope to make you so self-conscious that as you go about your job tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, you're going to remember some of these nonsensical things that good salespeople do because they're not pros. It's just common sense that everything we do is selling, but the average salesman doesn't understand that. He doesn't understand, this is unfortunate, that everything is selling. He doesn't understand that when a department store sends their delivery people out with clean, well-pressed uniforms, they're selling. That's the reason why a lot of salesmen aren't careful about their appearance. The spots on their suit, the lack of press in the pants, or the frayed cuffs, or the dirty linen. A lot of them don't understand the telephone company, the greatest monopoly of all time, and one that's under least fire from the government or the public, spent millions of dollars doing what? Why, trying to put a smile in the voice of the operator that you and I never see, because that's selling. And why? Why, because they've so changed the conduct of those unseen voices that today you can get a wrong number, you have to wait for a long-distance call, you can blow your stack, you can curse them out. You can't pick a fight with those dames anymore. No back talk. That's right, isn't it? Remember the change? They spent millions of dollars. Why? Because that's selling. They know that's selling. A purchasing agent, if he's any good as a salesman, the good ones are bound to be salesmen. A purchasing agent that's a good one doesn't sit there like a great stone face saying no, 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 no to the salesman. What does he do? Why, he says to the salesman, look, Joe, why don't you go back to the factory and see if they can't make that out of plastic instead of metal? Because if you could engineer 3 pounds of weight out of that, we could probably use that. Or why don't you make that with the corners round instead of square? Or why don't you countersink it so the screws heads don't show? Or why don't you make it cheaper so... What's he doing? Why, he's selling the salesman the idea of going back to his factory to get something that he can buy effectively, efficiently, and economically for his employer. Everything is selling. But we've got to use common sense about it, and we don't. You and I know that there's one person that signs the order. But you and I know there's usually somebody else, 1, 2, 3 people that are helpful. I spend a lot of time in reception rooms. I watch a lot of salesmen handle the young lady who comes to the fence or sits behind the desk or the telephone. And I watch these salesmen. And they don't use common sense. Some of them forget to take their hat off when they speak to that young lady. Oh, yes, I know she doesn't make much money. Yes, I know the company have placed her there for the convenience and service of the salesman. But it makes a lot of difference whether that girl picks up the phone and said, Mr. Motley is here for his appointment, or whether she says, there's a Mr. Motley here who says he has an appointment with you. Let me illustrate my point by a true story. In 1941, I was traveling across the country to speak to a meeting just like this in San Francisco. As I told you earlier, I've been doing this for years, and I'm going to do it as long as I'm physically and financially able to. I had a day in Chicago between the time the Century arrived and the city of San Francisco left. And one of the bright young salesmen, the best I had in Chicago, said to me, if we go out to Swift and Company at the stockyards, I think we can sell them some advertising. We'd never had it. So I said, go ahead and fix up the date. He did for lunch. We went out. We talked to Vern Beatty and his associates. And at 4 o'clock, Vern said, you go down and talk to Mert Whelan of J. Waller Thompson, their advertising agency. Tell them what you told us, and I think we can do some business. And we grabbed a cab at the stockyards, beat it down to the Wrigley building, and we got off on the 7th floor where the main reception room of this great advertising agency is. And as we stepped off the car, we met a dear little old lady, all dressed in black, since retired, Mrs. Davidson, leaving, pulling on her long black gloves. The office was closed. They had a staggered closing system. They had closed early on account of traffic congestion. And what did my smart salesman do? Use common sense? We'd just been out talking to the customer, the guy who spends $15 million a year in advertising. He'd told us to come down there. And so we began to throw our weight around. We began to impress this little girl, this elderly lady, with how important we were and how she had to take her gloves off and go back and find Whelan for us. Only she wasn't impressed. So I pushed this smart guy, without good sense, aside. And I began to pitch a little woo at the old girl. I learned a long time ago that any time a woman feels you need her, she'll do darn near anything she can to help you. And she finally took her gloves off and got that metal-pointed pencil and started dialing. It took her 10 minutes to find that guy in the maze of offices scattered over 5 floors. We never could have done it. We had an hour's meeting with him. I made my train for San Francisco. And when I was turning around to come back 2 days later, I got a wire from that salesman that said we had $104,000 worth of 4-color Swift advertising. Who made that sale? Motley, the smart man from the head office? The smart salesman in Chicago? Or that little old lady in black that was there when we needed her and found the guy that we had to see to make the sale? Common sense, isn't it? I won't permit any salesman that works for me to smoke while he sells. If I catch him doing it, I'll fire him. They know that. And why? Well, I learned the hard way, the way most pros did. Years ago, I was invited by the head of one of the divisions of a great motor car corporation to sit in while the advertising agents made the presentation. A big fellow from New York, head of a big New York agency. I was vastly impressed. I'd never seen one of those things before. He must have had $25,000 worth of artwork and comprehensives and charts and market analysis studies and everything else. And when he got all through, my friend, the head of this division of the great motor car corporation, left the room first because he was the big wheel. And as he shook hands with his president of the New York agency on leaving, he said, "This wasn't very important to you, was it?" And the agent's face turned as white as my shirt. Of course it was important to him. $7 or $8 million involved. And then my friend gave me the tip-off. He said it wasn't as important as 4 cigarettes. Then I remembered. That man hadn't been going more than about 5 minutes before he started that old familiar search for that pack. He got the cigarettes, he tapped them, he lit it, he puffed. Somebody had to find him an ashtray. He broke the continuity. He lost his audience 4 times. And what for? 4 lousy cigarettes. I don't smoke cigarettes, I smoke cigars. But I don't smoke them anymore when I sell. Because I began to wonder how many times I'd been selling a dirty, second-hand, chewed-up cigar butt as I pointed to the price list or some of the things on those signs and whatnot. What for? Not common sense. I fired a good man 3 years ago. I paid $750 for a statistical study, a market study, to permit him to sell an account. I went with him while he did it. We had a receptive audience. The prospect was willing. He cleaned off his whole desk, glass-topped. And we stretched out all these figures, $750 worth. But this guy had to smoke a cigarette. He just couldn't stand it. And he lit a cigarette. And he laid it down on the edge. Glass covered, couldn't do any harm. But in the shifting of these long sheets of paper, statistical material, the cigarette got knocked on the floor, and before it hit the rug hardly, the prospect is up and around the desk and picks it up. What was he looking at? $750 worth of figures, or that stinking cigarette that my salesman had left burning on the edge of his desk? Oh, yes, I know. I have ashtrays on my desk. I have salesmen come to see me, and they say, "May I smoke?" very politely. And I always say, "Of course." And then under my breath, "You damn fool." And why? Because I find myself looking at this chump, dragging that stuff down into his navel, and then for 5 minutes as he talks, it comes out of his eyes, ears, nose, and everything else. And I'm fascinated by it. What for? What for? What'd you go there to do? Put in an imitation of a smokestack on wheels? You went there to sell him something, didn't you? Not blow smoke at his face. It's just common sense that you ought to know how you look to the prospect. But I'll give you 6-2 and even that 90% of the people in this room have no idea how they look to the man across the desk. They've never taken the trouble to find out. I didn't either. Until one night when I was taking a refresher course in the Book Cadillac bar with another salesman. And he said to me, "Motley, you went to college, didn't you?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "You got a Phi Beta Kappa kid, didn't you?" And I said, "Sure, why?" Well, he said, "I don't understand why you insist on making people believe that you're a tough guy, that you have no education." I said, "What do you mean?" Well, he said, "You talk out of the corner of your mouth." I said, "I do not." He said, "You do too." The argument went on far into the night. It was a draw. I woke up the next morning hungover white like a weeping willow, but not so hungover that I didn't remember that crack. I didn't believe it. And I went out to see a friend of mine, the advertising manager of the Chrysler Corporation, R.M. Rowland, now assistant sales manager of DeSoto in Detroit. And I said, "Rolly, you're a friend of mine. Tell me the truth. Do I talk out of the corner of my mouth?" And he said, "You certainly do, and I've often wondered why." Well, Mrs. Motley and the kids were in hysterics for months while the old man practiced his pitch in front of a mirror. But I don't talk out of the corner of my mouth anymore. Found out another thing, too. If I could keep on the rails with that funny-looking puss staring back at me out of the mirror, not even the stoniest face buyer could throw me off the track. I thought I discovered a new and wonderful fundamental principle of sales training. I told it to a sales manager, a friend of mine. He said, "Motley, that's old stuff. We have every year what we call the mirror contest. I've got 32 men on the road. I ask them for 6 weeks, twice a week, to practice their pitch before a mirror." And he said, "We always show an increase in sale, even the poorest salesman." How do you know how you look to the guy? I remember the last fascinating specimen that sat across from me. This is what he did all the time he was in there. This is what he did all the time. All the time. I found myself marveling at the durability of the human ear that could stand that sort of thing. That gouging, that digging in the ear with that forefinger. And then I found myself speculating as to what would happen if he ever succeeded in breaking through and getting inside that damn ear. The unfortunate, the tragic part about it was he didn't know he was doing it. He didn't have sense enough to go and find out how he looked to the guy on the other side of the desk. I instruct my salesmen not to take their hat and coat in the office when they make a call. I've had a lot of fellows say to me, well, there isn't any place to put it. And I have said to them, throw it on the floor and put the dry cleaning on the expense account. They say, well, a lot of times you leave it out there, it might be stolen. I said, all right, take out an insurance policy and put that on the expense account, too. Why? You spend a lot of time getting the body in front of a prospect, and then what do? Why, you lug your hat and coat in to advertise to the guy that you're a bird of passage. You don't have to pay very much attention to me. I'm not going to stay very long, mister. You spend a lot of time trying to meet him on an equal footing, don't you? And there's that picture of that dynamic, alert salesman sitting across from you with an overcoat, a briefcase, and a hat piled up on his lap. Stripped for action. Oh, yeah, sure. Doesn't make sense. How'd I find that out? Years ago, traveling in Indiana with a salesman of mine, and a good one, too. We were calling on the Stokely Van Camp Company in Indianapolis. Warren Tingdale was then sales manager. When we walked in the floor below, the telephone operator was at the telephone booth. She said, Tingdale's expecting you. Go right upstairs. We did. As we walked in the outer office, two girls are pounding keys. There's no chairs, no hat racks, nothing but the tops of some filing cabinets behind, and I know they're covered that thick with dust. But I got rid of my hat and coat. But this chump I'm with didn't. He lugs them in wearing the coat. 5 minutes after I started talking to Tingdale, Tingdale turns to this guy and said, look, it's warm in here and cold outside. Don't you take your coat off? The guy said, no, I'm all right, I'm fine. 3 more times while we're in there, Tingdale stops everything and worries about this slob wearing an overcoat in a hot office. What for? Doesn't make sense, does it? Of course not. I don't care how long or how successfully you've been in business. Neither you nor I are smart enough to remember all we know. Last January, as I attended a few of Jack Lacey's lectures in San Francisco, I found myself sitting next to a man 78 years old who came every year and loved it and went away refreshed and inspired. He never heard a thing new, and I've told you nothing that you didn't know here tonight, really nothing. But it was important that it be told. Why? Because we're not smart enough to remember all we know. Maybe you think you are, but listen to my concluding story, and then maybe you'll agree you're not. In 1940, after a successful tour of the branches, I was taken back to New York by the great corporation I worked for. They made me a vice president and a director of the company. They gave me a private office with a rug on the floor, not linoleum. They gave me 2 secretaries instead of 1. The office didn't have 1 window, it had 2 windows, so if things were bad, I had a choice of jumping. They even let me okay my own expense account. Now, you can't get any bigger in business than that. And what did I do? Why, a characteristically human thing. I decided to show these yokels in New York how we did it out in Detroit, Chicago, St. Louis, Cleveland, and whatnot. I rolled up my sleeves, picked up 3 or 4 tough accounts. One of them was the American Tobacco Company. At that time, there was a man by the name of George Washington Hill. He was the president of the company, chairman of the board, tobacco sales buyer, sales manager, advertising manager, janitor. He was the American Tobacco Company. If you didn't sell him, you didn't sell the American Tobacco Company. Now, I've told salesmen thousands of times, never let the guy get your goat no matter what he does. Don't show any irritation. Don't flip your wig. Be cool. And what did I do? I wasn't smart enough to remember what I knew. He unfolded his arms long enough to pick up a box, leather-covered, shaped like a carton of cigarettes, opened it up, there was some cigarettes in it, and he shoved it out at me. He didn't say, light up a lucky have a cigarette. He wasn't polite, he was rude. And I said, no thanks. And he said, why not? And in a rather loud tone of voice, I said, I don't smoke cigarettes. And in a louder tone of voice, he said, why not? And in a still louder tone of voice, I said, I don't like cigarettes. Now, I've told salesmen thousands of times, never yell at a prospect or a customer. It just doesn't make any sense. I've read those books about how to win friends and influence people. I wasn't smart enough to remember what I knew. And then he said, don't you smoke anything? I said, yeah, I smoke cigars. He said, what kind? Oh, yeah. I've told salesmen thousands of times, never call on a prospect till you know his brand names, what he makes, his hobbies, the names of his kids. I spent 30 days getting an appointment with this guy, and I don't even know what kind of cigars he makes. So I told him the truth. I said, I smoke Anthony and Cleopatra's, and I suppose you're going to tell me they're no good. He said, not at all. We make those. He rang a bell, and a young man walked in with a box, and we bit off the ends and lit up and became friends, and Motley was saved by the bell, but not because he was smart enough to remember what he knew. This is a great profession, fundamentally important to everyone in America. It deserves a professional attitude from all of us. It deserves the kind of self-analysis I've tried to stimulate in your minds. It deserves the inspiration and the courage and the drive that Lacey talked to you about. And it deserves, above everything else, the true professional attitude. And that is the constant knowledge that no matter how good you are, you still aren't good enough. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Red. Thank you, Jack. We shall long remember the inspiration you have given us this evening, both of you, in this refresher course of one evening.